Good afternoon. If you're listening in on our webinar, thank you for joining us today. We had a break last month, so welcome back if you're a seasoned webinar listener. It's great to have quite so many of you registered for today. I'd like to think that you've been missing our insights and the ones you get particularly from John Grant and our other guests. If that's so, there's plenty for you here today. I'm Becca Rowland and I'm a partner at Midas Aviation, and I'm going to be hosting the webinar today. Somewhat inevitably, we're going to be asking, where does the industry go next? What should we expect for the next 6 months or so? We've now experienced 2 successive lackluster summer seasons. The months between June and August used to be when air travel peaked and airlines made their money. And we've remarked before at how there have been relatively few airline failures, but how much longer can this continue? We know that demand remains soft, so what should we expect now? We're going to be looking at a lot of OAG data today, as well as some data from elsewhere, to try and draw out insights to help us understand what's happening in the market and what we can expect going forward. If you've registered today, you will be sent a link, I believe, to the webinar afterwards, so you can get the slides afterwards. So yeah, be reassured. We always get questions from people saying, will I get the slides afterwards? Yes, you'll always get the slides. If we have time, we'll do some questions and answers at the end, but usually we take questions as we're going through. So do put your questions in the area on the webinar box, the questions area. We keep looking at them as we're going through and we try and pick them up and answer them as we go. So no need to wait for the end for your questions. So with us today, as always, we've got John Grant, OAG's Chief Analyst. John, you're never short of a few things to say about the industry, and I don't suppose having a couple of months off over the summer has left you with less to say, so welcome back. I don't think you've really had much of summer though, have you, John? You've not managed to get away.
No, I've not got away. Becca, I've missed you. 2 months without doing the webinar. It's so good to be back. No, I haven't been away. I tried to get to the US 3 times and President Biden stopped me every occasion. So BA have got my cash and I'm still waiting for my vouchers, British Airways. So get your fingers out, please.
Yeah, so you're going to have a lot to say today about the lack of air travel that's taking place still to all of our frustration. With us, we've also got Wilco. Thanks for joining us, Wilco. You've been on our webinars before, but not since I think earlier last year. So it's really good to have you back, especially as we're going to be showing that Amsterdam Schiphol is the busiest international airport this week in the world. How's Amsterdam been for the last year, 18 months?
Yeah, well, thanks for having me. Last time you asked me, that was more than a year ago, and I had hoped that it would only be a one-off show, because then we would have been out of this whole crisis. But unfortunately, you guys wanted to have me again on this webinar, so the crisis just continued. Yeah, well, I mean, I haven't been traveling at all, but we did see traffic pick up the last few months, especially the summer was pretty good, but I think we'll be seeing that later on. But we're honored also to be seen as the biggest capacity in international traffic at this moment, and maybe a position we would like to cherish for the coming months, maybe.
Yeah, well, yeah, that sounds good. Good place to start. Anyway, it's nice to start on something positive and optimistic. Let's dive into looking at some of the data. This is where we are, state of recovery. We always get questions about, can we break out China from Asia? So that's what we've done this time. You can see the trend lines for where capacity is versus the same month in 2019. I wish we weren't still looking back at 2019, but that seems to be one of the ways that we can still sort of understand what's happening. And there's some really distinct trends here. North America, Latin America, Africa, Middle East, all sort of growing reasonably steadily, and then strange things happening with China, with the rest of Asia, with Southwest Pacific, with Europe. John, do you want to talk us through the patterns we've seen, especially over the last couple of months over the summer?
Sure. So, you know, it's been fascinating because ultimately the numbers haven't really changed all that much at the headline levels. You know, we hover about the 78, 79 million seats a week around the globe. And yet when you cut it down by these regions, Becca, it becomes so interesting to see how things have changed. I mean, China in itself, we had the round of Delta vaccine cases in January and February, and we saw capacity fall off a cliff. And again, another round of infections in late July and early August. And you can see the Chinese just cut capacity dramatically, and they stop people traveling, and they instruct people not to travel. And you can see it's a very short, sharp pattern of virtual lockdowns in some regions in China that have a dramatic impact on their capacity, and then it bounces back pretty quickly. And I think that is an indication of how perhaps other country markets may ultimately handle further outbreaks of COVID infection if they deem it necessary to restrict air travel. And yet, at the same time, we see the Southwest Pacific region, which essentially is Australia and New Zealand, collapsing from June onwards. The bubble burst across the Tasman. I'm surprised it lasted as long as it did. It was always a PR stunt rather than anything that was sustainable over any length of time. It bought some time for people to think about other options for reopening travel. And hopefully Australia has now realised that zero COVID is unobtainable. It's not something that you can control. The Delta variant is not does not respect borders. It will move across borders regardless of having a visa. So all that's very very interesting. It's good to see the announcement today from Qantas about they've actually published the dates that they're going to recommence services to London and some other destinations from the 18th and the 19th of December. So that's a sign of positivity and maybe a recovery there. But I think the other one is, which is really good, is Europe, and just seeing how capacity has grown from April, once Europe had got control of vaccination rates and there were common areas of travel, to see capacity grow from -70 up to only -30% of its normal levels is good. But then again, it's going to fall back in the next couple of months because we enter the Northern Hemisphere's winter season, and there is just traditionally less demand, particularly in the leisure sectors. But it just goes to show that once you reopen capacity and take those regulations and travel restrictions away, things can change very, very quickly, and indeed can change in both directions very, very quickly, up and down.
Yeah, Wilco, do you have anything you can add to that from the sort of European perspective in particular? Have we've seen capacity increase quite dramatically over the summer. Has that been a challenge for the airlines, or were they ready to do that, and are they able to add more if there was the opportunity?
Well, I think it has been a challenge for not only the airlines but also for the airports. So the airlines, they were waiting to see when can they jump in and start flying. Once the vaccination numbers in Europe increased and it was possible to travel more safely, they added the capacity as quickly as possible, mostly to leisure destinations. So that's, I think, where the capacity really came into the European market. I think Europe is, of course, including UK, I assume, and you guys the UK has been kind of limited in what they could do. So I think that yellow line could have been higher if things had been better. But the sad thing is that once borders close again, then it does get a little bit unstable in that sense. But we saw that, and as I said, it was a challenge also for the airports because you can add in the flights, but you also have to have everything ready on the ground with the ground handling possibilities. So I think a lot of airports, including Schiphol, had some massive challenges in trying to cope with the higher number of passengers, and also with social distancing and the extra checks that had to be done at the airport. It wasn't an easy summer at all. So everybody's happy that the passenger numbers are up, but it was a lot of hard work.
And how far below, we're obviously showing capacity here, and we always get people saying, well, can we not show traffic? But the traffic data is just comes in a bit behind the capacity. So it's, you know, the capacity data is just of the moment, it's a bit more topical. And we know that traffic is behind capacity, but what are you seeing at Amsterdam in terms of that difference between traffic and capacity? How far behind is the passenger numbers?
Yeah, well, just to give an idea, in the beginning of this year, we only, I mean, load factors were, maybe 35%. So if you look at the seat capacity, as you put in there, if you only have 35%, but in August, our load factors went up to 70, 73, 75%, which is of course way down compared to 2019 levels. But at least it's the aircraft are filling up. Let's put it that way, and that's of course a good sign. But at least in Amsterdam, what we saw is that even though there was less capacity, the number of passengers, most of the flights would be a little bit more in the same peak hours. So it was relatively as busy as it was in 2019, but the rest of the hours of the day, it was relatively quiet.
I guess Wilco, the fact that the load factors are as high as that is great news. Of course, for the airlines, it's how much have they had to discount and what yields are they getting to stimulate that level of demand. I mean, from your own personal experience of just, you know, the market sentiment, do you think yields are soft compared to previous years?
Most probably. I mean, everything is very much leisure focused, so it might be softer. But on the other hand, I think there's a lot of demand. People really wanted to travel again, or at least, maybe visit family again. So they were willing to pay for it. Let's put it that way. I'm not saying they're paying more than they did before, but I think the willingness to pay is there. But I think, to be able to travel, you want to be sure that it's safe, that you don't get any surprises, that your vaccination passport is correct, etc. So things like that, and that there's a lot of uncertainty, and that kind of doesn't really help to stimulate the market. But the brave ones did get on board and did have a good, did have a chance to go on vacation or visit their family.
Yeah, and I think, Becca, we come on to this later. I mean, it's important to recognise, you know, there has been considerable growth in some markets in the last couple of months, and looking further out, there are some sparks of markets that could be reopening or steps that are being taken to help them reopen. But as an industry, all of these markets are between sort of -30 and -50% of what they were 2 years ago. So there is a long journey of recovery that we still have to go. And I think Boeing finally admitted yesterday that they don't expect a recovery before 2024. So, you know, we're nowhere near out of the woods yet.
Well, Wilco, we've had a question from Andreas about how Amsterdam is dealing with the sort of control side of things at the airport, you know, bearing in mind some of the chaos, which is perhaps a polite way of saying what's happened at Heathrow, taking so long to pass through controls for incoming passengers. Is that something Amsterdam's got a handle on?
Yeah, but I mean, of course, with ups and downs, I could say, we really try to look into how we can help and in fact, also to forecast what the passenger numbers will be for the coming days, or maybe even the coming hours, to make sure that that staff is in place, because it's a security staff, but it's also ground handling. A lot of staff working for ground handling agents, working at the airport, and maybe got laid off last year and did not come back, or cannot yet come back, or are now working in a very different industry. So I think you could say the number of people that could help to do the operation is maybe limited. And I think it's not that airlines are not going to pay much more just to make sure. You could maybe want to have more staff, but if their staff is not available because they're all working in call centers for trying to find out how do you say to control the COVID, or working in other places, that makes it more difficult. So you cannot scale up instantly. Let's put it that way.
No, and Wilco, that's a really good point. And one of those sad moments at 3 o'clock in the morning, I was reading the Sydney Herald, as everyone does in London, and the Airports and Airlines Association there, are lobbying the Australian government to say they need months to be able to resource back up to the levels to operate successfully in Australia, and that's all about getting back check-in agents, getting back immigration officials, making sure all the protocols are observed and the processes are put in place. When you've closed the market for 2 years, you can't just suddenly expect everyone to flood back and say, I'm so pleased to be back at work. They found other careers.
Yeah, correct. Yeah.
Okay, let's move on to some other slides because we've got plenty more to look at today. This is the same sort of capacity versus 2 years ago by week for the last 12 weeks. So it covers the whole summer period. And I guess the sort of key thing we can see here is that dip in China where they went from 6% versus 2019 at the end of July down to minus 35% 2 weeks later. So just the sheer scale of the capacity withdrawal in a short space of time. And then within weeks, they're back up sort of close to where they were. So very interesting, isn't it, that scale of change in capacity. But overall, John, we're minus 29%, which is the best we've seen for a while at a global level.
It is, and we should be grateful for that. But this time last year, we were hoping that by the second quarter of 2021, COVID-19 would be behind most of us, and the industry would be well set on its recovery. And that sadly isn't the case. And you can see conditions where capacity and demand could actually fall over the next couple of months and probably into the first quarter of 2022. It's
we're certainly seeing a slight drop here this week in Europe and again in where was I looking? One of the other markets. I think there was another one when I was looking at it earlier, or maybe it's flat in North America. This is a softening, isn't it, of the market?
Well, yeah, North America has had a really good, very strong domestic summer season, and there was around late July, mid-August confidence that the corporate demand would be quite strong in the last quarter of this year, but the Delta variant has run amok. Very large infection rates, 80 million residents in the United States still not vaccinated, and Ed Bastian, the CEO of Delta Airlines, was saying last week that he expects that confidence and corporate demand has been set back by about 90 days, which really takes it into the first quarter of next year at the earliest. OAG's actually put out a survey that we undertook in the United States on traveller sentiment, and there is still a lot of uncertainty around the consumers and particularly corporate demand to travel in the next 6 months. So we've got to be very careful about this. We know in November the European season slows down. Lots of capacity is normally taken out anyway as airlines scale back their operations slightly, and if that is the pattern that we see, then what is currently 79 million seats a week could quite comfortably come back down to 73, 74 million without much effort from the airlines.
Okay, let's look at again capacity. We're still sticking with this capacity versus this week versus the same week 2 years ago, but looking at individual countries and seeing domestic and international. So we've got a handful of countries now: Nigeria, Tunisia, Russia, China, Korea, where domestically capacity is up on where it was. And I think OAG is going to be putting something out, a blog in the next week or so on what's happening with Russia, because that's quite an interesting story. I think they're about 27% ahead now of where they were 2 years ago for domestic. So, Russians clearly wanting to travel, happy to travel, if that's a response to demand. Netherlands, you're 35% down. Wilco, is that where would you hope to be by the end of the year, do you think?
Well, everybody would love to be back to the new levels, but I think that would be very optimistic. John mentioned 2024, that we will get back to the levels of 2019. I think that's also a little bit how we as an airport look at that. I think the international traffic, I mean, yeah, well, the Netherlands doesn't really have domestic traffic, so everything's international. And we see that the demand for, or the traffic capacity put into the European market, that maybe is getting back to what it should be. We saw this week that Finnair will be going back to double daily from Helsinki to Amsterdam. So I think some airlines are seeing the confidence again to start bringing it back to previous levels. But I think the biggest challenge for everybody is, in fact, the real intercontinental flights. Especially to Asia is a big problem. We don't really expect that to be opening up, certainly not this year, but also how will it develop in 2022? That's still an unsure. Will we get access to more flights to China? Thailand is in fact still closed. Even Singapore, we have flights to Singapore, but it's a limited number of passengers going that way. So yeah, I think we are seeing new initiatives. I mean, I think Singapore and has announced what they call a vaccinated travel lane to Germany. Let's hope that also can be enrolled to other parts of the world to at least get the traffic back up.
The Asia numbers, Becca, are scary, quite frankly.
Right.
And, you know, here we are 20 months into this event, and many of these country markets are very reliant on international services to and from China. And it's like a deck of cards, you know, until China reopens for international services, then the likelihood of Japan, Korea, Thailand, Malaysia, and Singapore and other countries seeing a significant improvement in their international capacity and international trade is extremely limited. And, you know, China is not going to open all at once. It is likely to be very selective about those country markets with which it reopens international air services. And even when it opens them, the types of controls that we have seen in place to date, such as limits on load factors, penalties if you bring in anyone who has a COVID infection, even though you may not be aware of it when they board the aircraft. It's going to be a slow recovery process throughout the ASPAC region. And that is a big concern for me. That is, you know, that is back towards the end of 2024, unless there is a material breakthrough soon in the way the event is being handled.
It's difficult, isn't it, to begin to think about which markets will open first with China. On the one hand, we know that the Chinese traveller really values safety, so you'd like to think Australia and New Zealand and maybe the high vaccination rates in Europe will make those attractive, but they're long-haul markets. We know that in some ways China has I guess a lot of soft power over this, so some of the decisions may be as much political as about where demand is or where it's safe. And so I think Gary, when we did the webinar this morning, was saying that places like Thailand are actually beginning to market themselves to Russian travellers because they can see the Russians are travelling. So once they can open up in Thailand, maybe in certainly the short to medium term, they'll be looking for outbound travellers, tourists from other markets other than China. It's quite. We're going to see quite a lot of change, aren't we, in the way people travel to and from, which country pairs are working.
Absolutely. And, you know, tourism boards have, and here's a word that we've learned in the pandemic, tourism boards have got to pivot their strategies. They've got to find and look at alternate markets in the short to medium term that, you know, can fill the hotel beds that have been left vacated because then their major source markets have closed and are unlikely to reopen. Someone's asked the question about what's the story with Mexico's international capacity, and the story is Mexico essentially didn't close any of its borders for international travel throughout the COVID-19 pandemic, and they've had US citizens flooding into Cancun and other such destinations, and indeed this coming winter, capacity to Cancun from North America and the United States is about 20% up on winter 2019. So, you know, another pivot. US airlines have put more and more capacity in there because they know it's a slam dunk. They can fill the seats, and for an American going to Mexico is a short haul flight.
We've talked a lot about confidence, haven't we? And I guess that where you've got a market like Mexico, which has signaled we are open, it's a bit the same with Greece, you know, so the traveller knows this is a market that's not going to change. They're not expecting to book now and then find they can't travel. And that's quite a big part of getting air travel moving, isn't it?
Absolutely.
I think that shows
if we look at the European numbers, Greece international capacity only -4. Turkey, which adopted a similar strategy to most countries, but you know, good old UK decided it was a red list country for some reason, -27. If you took Turkey and you excluded the UK, that would probably be only -5 or -10 maximum. So you're right, those countries that have been very clear in their positioning from the beginning and stuck to it have enjoyed the benefits of perhaps more tourists retain their international capacity.
And just returning to Asia Pacific, I think one of the things that's going to be very difficult for some of these countries, Thailand, Malaysia, Vietnam, you know, by the time they come through this, they'll have had 2 years almost without those sort of tourists that they would expect to see. And frankly, some of the tourist infrastructure won't be there, will it? It won't have survived that period of time. So going back to Thailand next summer actually may not be the same experience that it used to be.
Are you telling me there'll be no Starbucks at Bangkok?
I suspect the big international chains will still survive, but your mom and pop businesses are going to be struggling, aren't they?
Absolutely, and you know that's one of the things that people are saying about Phuket and the sandbox. You know that many of the small traders and the local restaurants are closed. So it's not the product and it's not the experiential sort of holiday that they were anticipating. But it is chicken and egg. You know, we've got to see these people, holiday makers coming back, tourists coming back, and then those economies will begin to recover as well.
Yeah, let's hope they will bounce back, because that would be a shame if that's not possible. Yeah, they're so dependent on that, on the tourists, so it will come back, don't you think?
Oh, I'm sure it will come back. It's just kind of it just takes time, doesn't it? It takes time for the investment to come back in.
Yeah.
We've got a slide now with a few, just some of the sort of news type items that we've seen over the summer, given that we've had a little bit of a break. I don't know, there are particular things here that stand out, John. We've got a few items about airlines, about some of the aircraft orders. We've already talked about Singapore beginning to abandon their zero case approach, and maybe they're sort of a bellwether of what's going to happen across Southeast Asia. Maybe other countries are beginning to realise more that you can't pursue that. And certainly we're getting signals from Australia now that when they reach 70% of the population vaccinated, they will open up more.
Yeah, it's been quite fascinating to watch this. You mentioned it as we began the webinar, but there hasn't been as many airline failures as perhaps you would have expected. Sadly, Philippine Airlines at least have disappeared until early January, when they will plan to relaunch as Philippine Airlines V7 or V8, whatever it happens to be this time. And South African Airways are back again. And Alitalia will re-emerge with new Armani uniforms and the same working practices as they've probably had in the past. But I think some of the things that are incredible, really, considering 1/3 of the world's aircraft fleets are probably still grounded in various parts of the world, is that LATAM have placed orders for A320s. Jet2 has placed orders for new aircraft. Ryanair are apparently talking to Airbus about switching out from Boeing into a larger Airbus element to their fleet. So the airlines are still extremely optimistic about the medium to long term and are placing positions on new aircraft. So there's more and more capacity coming into the market, and unless someone scraps that 1/3 of capacity that is still grounded, we could be in a situation in 5 or 6 years' time when actually there is more capacity than is required in the market. And we know the principles of supply and demand. If there is too much capacity and we end up with low fares, it makes it very difficult for airlines to be profitable over an economic cycle.
And we've talked before that we are actually seeing quite a number of startup airlines. So we've listed some here, the sort of the big names that have gone into bankruptcy and beginning to emerge. But actually, there are plenty of new airlines coming on stream, aren't there?
In Hong Kong, we've got Greater Bay Airlines, which is really well financed and has already got aircraft and recruited pilots and cabin staff. And that's a fascinating situation, because that Hong Kong was a market that was just locked down. It was Cathay's market, and now in the new world order, there's going to be a serious competitor if Hong Kong ever reopens, which seems a bit of a struggle given their very tight restrictions on travel and vaccines, etc. And talking of vaccines, Becca, the whole thing about airlines requiring their staff to be vaccinated, clearly contentious, absolutely right, I think. Airlines have a duty of care to their employees to make sure they're protected from any passenger on board who may be infected. So, but it divisive as well, because clearly there are some workers who perhaps, for whatever reason, principles, lack of understanding of the benefits, whatever it may be, are not keen to be vaccinated. So, and for airports as well, check-in agents in exactly the same situations.
Yeah, correct. That is a big dilemma, I think, that airlines, but also airports, or everybody in the travel industry has. Who will be vaccinated? Are you allowed to demand that they are vaccinated, or how can you make sure that everybody is safe, not only to the employees themselves, but also to the passengers passing through?
Yeah.
It is interesting. I saw this morning that Delta Airlines, who had advised their staff that if you don't get vaccinated or double vaccinated, then you're going to have to pay $200 more per month for your insurance. That message resulted in an orderly queue of 4,000 employees who suddenly stepped forward to be double vaccinated. So, sometimes these, what look like draconian measures, are actually quite effective at spurring people on to getting vaccinated.
A bit of a nudge there, I think, isn't it?
Yeah.
That doesn't work in the Netherlands. Let's put it that way. Yeah.
I'm sure it wouldn't.
Too independent-minded, aren't you?
Yeah.
So this is a slide. We showed something a bit like this 2 months ago, but it just had one dot for each country. And what we've done is updated it and show now how countries have moved over the last 6 weeks or so, maybe slightly longer than 6 weeks. So along the bottom axis, along the horizontal axis, we've got international capacity this week versus the same week 2 years ago. And on the vertical, we've got the proportion of the population with at least one dose of vaccine. So if we thought that getting vaccinated was going to allow international air travel to start, we would see all of these move from a sort of bottom left to top right, like we see with India here, Turkey, Greece, Mexico, Russia. But there's plenty of instances where the movement seems to be the other way. We've got Colombia over here, and then this whole group of Southeast Asian countries, Vietnam, Thailand, New Zealand, Australia, there's Japan and Korea in here as well. It's just not as simple, is it, John, as vaccination helps travel grow. There's a policy thing going on, and there's also this sort of level of 70% of the population being vaccinated seems to enable things to happen as well in a way that lower levels of vaccination doesn't.
Yeah, it's is this 70 or 80% a magic number at which point everything changes? No, it isn't. And international capacity is built around the assumption of reciprocity of access from the other end of the market. So, it's wonderful that the UK has nudged up slightly more to above 70% vaccination rates. But when major markets like the US continue to block people from entering, then international capacity is constrained. It doesn't fly, and that's the problem. There's a lot of countries that have made great progress, and particularly in that left-hand side of your slide, Becca. Malaysia, Japan, South Korea have all moved the needle quite significantly in terms of vaccination rates, but without their surrounding markets reopening and allowing freedom of movement, then it's virtually impossible for anything to change. And that's where the whole discussion begins to break down about, where countries are providing reciprocity. I think it's fascinating that the US, the European Union, and the United Kingdom, which Wilco sometimes does still feel like Europe, decided in June that we would allow US nationals and unrestricted access to Europe if they had been vaccinated. The US never reciprocated, and now, of course, the European Union has removed or suggested that member states can remove the freedom of movement. So it's fascinating that we still lack so much joined up thinking between governments as we work our way through to the end of this time.
We've got a question, John, from Andreas again about will JetBlue keep continuing service to the UK? We know JetBlue started service to the UK fairly recently. If the US don't lift their restrictions, I think you said to me just before the call that the British Prime Minister is due to go to the US. So might we see some sort of movement on that?
Has he got a return ticket, or is it one way? It's a soundbite, isn't it? You can take the photo now, shaking hands, saying our working group is still working on this. This is the same working group that started its work sometime back in May when the G7 met in Cornwall in the United Kingdom, and they've still not made any progress. So my expectation is the US will not open to international travel from Europe, from China, Iran, South Africa, all of the countries that are on their blacklist before Thanksgiving. And maybe at that point the market will reopen just in time for Christmas.
Well, that would be nice, wouldn't it?
It's nice to see that how the Netherlands high vaccination and even higher, or relatively going back to more capacity in the market than others. Maybe it can be an example for others. Yeah. Canada also.
Is there anything you can point to that's been done in the Netherlands that has made international travel sort of suddenly take off again? Is there something that we can learn from what's happening?
Well, it's more, I think it's the possibility of the freedom or the demand that's still there. So once it was allowed to travel, I think the Netherlands was, compared to other European countries, relatively slow in the vaccination process in the beginning. But we really picked up, got to speed very quickly. And by the summer, in fact, everybody that wanted to, could be vaccinated, was vaccinated. So that kind of freed up the possibility to travel again, and that did happen. Of course, sometimes people were surprised by borders still being closed, or that the Netherlands was seen as safe, but the other country had some other policy rules, and that made it very difficult. We had a time that also the UK and also the US were put on a little bit on the not safe side. But luckily, as of the end of September, that will also be taken out. So anybody vaccinated from the UK or from the US is allowed to go to the Netherlands, as long as they can prove that they are vaccinated and also have a test. So that will open up the market. But of course, it has to be reciprocated. We would also want to be the other way around. So we do see it shouldn't be only travel from one side to the other, but it should be both ways.
So I think the UK is the 22nd of September, isn't it, Wilco? So,
that's right. That's correct.
So
yeah,
that was ready for the 23rd. I'll be there.
Yeah, 23rd. You're most welcome to visit us here. Yeah.
Good.
As long as you're vaccinated, please.
Yeah, I'm safe.
Great.
Good.
Okay, we've looked at a lot of OAG data till now, and we always like to bring in some data from other places. And this is from Bloomberg. They produce a resilience ranking each month. And at the beginning of the summer, I think they added some elements to their metrics that covered air travel. So I thought it'd be good to pop this in this month. So you can see one of their metrics is flight capacity. Another one is vaccinated travel routes. So they're seeing these as key metrics in understanding country national resilience. So again, good news for the Netherlands. They've moved up from 12 places, I think, from or is it up from 12th place to number 2. New Zealand moved down from number 1 to 26, so they're not shown on here anymore. This is just the top 20. I think one of the things that Bloomberg, when they put this out, commented on was just that it's really difficult to be consistently resilient, that the way COVID and the different variants are affecting the market means that what works at one point in time doesn't seem to be working at another point in time. It's difficult, isn't it, John, for countries to know how to navigate this?
Absolutely, so many variables, so many different measurement points, very many different ways in measuring what the infection rates are. You know, some countries with very high levels of testing, some still with quite low levels of testing, which obviously impacts the results. So I think more than anything, Becca, it highlights that, you know, this is, even with the best will in the world, as we head through 2022 and on towards the full recovery, there are going to be bumps along that journey for every market and every country. And there may be very short, sharp lockdowns, closures, restrictions in capacity or whatever it may be. But it's not going to be a straight line. And even the most resilient, or what we thought were the most resilient, you know, this time last year, from an infection perspective, we were saying how well New Zealand and Australia and Vietnam were doing, and now in the cases of New Zealand and Australia, they're way behind in terms of recovery and you know, reopening to the rest of the world.
Okay, let's have a look at
there's no guarantee for the next month for everybody. That's right.
Okay.
Yeah.
I wanted us to look at some airlines now. So this is, again, just to looking at capacity as a proportion of 2019. This is for the month of August. We've put different airlines, some of the biggest names. It's not necessarily the top 20. It's a selection of large airlines that we thought were interesting. We put them on a line with Wizz right out at the front, with operating more than 100% of the capacity that they did in August 2019. And at the other end, we have Qantas, Cathay, BA, and Singapore Airlines. And then below that, we've just taken a few of the European low-cost airlines, just really to highlight how far apart the Wizz Airs and the Easyjets are. KLM is here, sort of in the front peloton, I guess, up here with Air China. So doing not so bad. John, what can we conclude from this? Is this just reflecting where we are with the national countries? And you know, I'm sure you're going to speak about the possibility of we believe it's Wizz that made a pitch for Easyjet just in the last week or so.
Well, I guess my first conclusion, Becca, is that I'm not colorblind. But when you look at this, I think the top line is just a stark representation of the challenge that many of the legacy carriers have. I mean, you have a cluster there of iconic, historic global brands, Qantas, Cathay, British Airways, Singapore, and to a lesser degree, perhaps Emirates and Lufthansa, who are flying more, that have just become trapped and behind the recovery curve because, in part, some of those governments and regulators have made it extremely difficult for them to operate any type of services. Some of the rules around crew rostering and quarantines that have been imposed in Hong Kong on Cathay Pacific are more than onerous. They're almost like prison sentences for their cabin staff. But you know, those airlines rely on sixth freedom traffic. They rely on connecting passengers across different continents, and you know that is extremely hard to create those traffic flows at this moment in time, and probably will be for some months to come as we continue. And we showed the numbers in Southeast Asia earlier, so many of those are going to be stuck waiting for some significant breakthroughs there. And then if we look at the European low cost, we don't know that it was Wizz Air that made a speculative bid for Easyjet last week. Many rumours suggest it was, but you would understand why. Easyjet, because they have a large or had a large proportion of their network based in the United Kingdom, were clearly at a greater risk and more exposed than their low-cost airlines competitors in Europe, who had a more pan-European network, and that means that they've fallen behind, and that makes it an easier buy. And for someone like Wizz Air, you know, who's in an expansive mindset, has a very low cost base and a good management team, an opportunity to make a predatory approach to Easyjet, who have some very large slot holdings at airports like London Gatwick that will in time recover to near full capacity, was a once in a lifetime opportunity to, you know, suddenly enter the London market in a very, very big way and take a large share. And it's really challenging to see, you know, all of these airlines are in their own rights very successful and will recover over time. But it's quite clear that certainly those that have been either the legacy carriers who rely on that sixth freedom traffic, or those that sadly have been part of the UK, will take longer to recover.
So try restarting. Unplug both of them, then plug the router back in. Wait 30 seconds.
Lost connection at the moment.
Connected to the internet.
We've had a comment in which I guess goes without saying, that when we look at these airlines, the ones up at the front here are predominantly airlines operating in markets that have major domestic markets. You know, the US carriers, American, United, Delta, Chinese carriers, Air China, China Eastern, China Southern, whereas these carriers, as John said, rely on sixth freedom traffic. And so it's definitely been harder for them. But I guess that makes it all the more remarkable to have
I think
KLM
would be an exception. Yeah.
Yeah, that's right.
In that sense.
So, you know, KLM sits there as if it's just one of this group, but actually it is pretty exceptional, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah. I think what we saw is that KLM, from the beginning of the whole crisis, they really did their utmost to keep what they call the skeleton network, and at least keep the points on the map, at least try to get everybody connected. And that kind of also saw that as they were flying to destinations, that meant that also a lot of passengers the only way to get from A to Z was through Amsterdam, maybe, because they were the only ones flying on certain routes. So we did see an increase of percentage-wise of the transfer passengers through Amsterdam. And that was pretty high in the beginning of last year, but also in the beginning of this year. And but once the market started opening in this summer, we did see transfer flows go back to, let's say, the same percentage as it was in 2019. So it's in fact the network that was put in place, and also with the cargo that was also in there, kind of made it sense to keep the network up and running, at least the destinations.
I'd love to talk to you, Wilco, about cargo, but we're going to run out of time. I think we've still got a few more slides. I know we've had one or two questions about what's happened with cargo. Maybe at the end we could touch on what your experience has been with cargo.
There's a point raised by Sean here about, you know, Wizz Air has increased their fleet by 50%, and that's why they are where they are. Yeah, you're absolutely right, Sean. But the point is, they didn't necessarily have to increase their fleet by 50%, did they? They could have deferred the aircraft deliveries. They could have elected not to fly those aircraft. But they've been really nimble, fleet of foot, and you know, as a result, they're producing as much capacity as they did in 2019. yes, aircraft utilization is down for nearly every airline, and we wrote a piece about that, I think, in the summer. I mean, Easyjet probably in early summer were only operating about 40% of their fleet, and they were working those aircraft about 8 or 9 hours a day. Ryanair had 100% of their fleet flying, but we're only flying an average of 2 to 3 hours a day. So different strategies, different approaches. But Becca, some of your metrics here are interesting, aren't they, about where these two airlines now stand?
Yeah, so this is, we put this together knowing that we would talk a little bit about Easyjet and Wizz. So we just compare a few metrics here, the number of seats, the ASKs, and the number of routes that they've operated by month through the last 18 months or so. And, so we can see Wizz last summer was operating more capacity than they had the previous summer. And then again this summer. So, but all through they've not dipped down as much as Easyjet has here. They've been quicker to come back, and it doesn't jump out at you, but you can see that they have recovered better. They've been more resilient in the marketplace, and certainly Easyjet had this sort of May, June last year. They just grounded everything to try and decide where they were going to go from that point, and it's a very different approach.
And it's a function of the markets in which they operate. And it's not just Easyjet. Jet2,
No.
A major low-cost carrier, cancelled all of their services, I think, until around June the 22nd, because of the UK government's regulatory approach to air travel and a lack of confidence in the market. There's ministerial changes being made in the UK at the moment. One can only hope, I guess.
I'm going to whiz through a few more. We've got a few more slides.
Oh, very good, Becca. Very good.
So, staying with that sort of thought about consolidation, I know, John, you have quite strong views about the fact that we probably should see more consolidation. If we look here at the number of airlines that have filed schedules for this week across all the IATA regions, these are 116 in Western Europe. Is silly, isn't it? There's no other sector, is there, that has 116 competing companies within a region, unless they're quite small businesses.
Yeah, not that is so capital intensive as perhaps the airline industry. And throughout Europe, combination of Eastern and Western Europe, we're at nearly 200 airlines. It's just crazy that we have this fragmentation, part of which is historic, part of which is through the relative ease of market entry that is now possible, and partly because we've perhaps too many airports and too much airport capacity, and that allows some of these airlines to go off to new places and start new operations and see if they can be commercially successful. You have to think that aside from the Korean and Asiana consolidation that happened very early in this process, that as a consequence of what looks like being a very soft winter, that there will be more speculation and perhaps more consolidation. And you have Ethiopian in Africa who've developed lots of partnerships, strategic investments. We'll see more of those things happening around the world.
But John, interestingly, you say too many airports in Europe. I think we get complaints that we don't have enough capacity.
Yeah, absolutely, and it's the irony, isn't it? It's places such as yours, Wilco. I mean, 5 runways,
yeah.
4 in Amsterdam, 1 in Rotterdam.
Oh, that's another one. That's the 6th.
Oh, that's the 6th one. Okay. Yeah. And the thing about airports, as you well know, it's about critical mass, isn't it? It's about having the connectivity, the frequency, and then you look at airports. And in the UK, places like Teesside, places like Carlisle, Southend, where suddenly one airline disappears and 99% of their capacity and services disappear with them. Mm-hmm. It's a quandary for the industry, but it's a question, I guess, in the world of sustainability and the environment. do we need as many airports, or are some of those smaller airports perhaps better being consolidated into one?
Well, certainly this chart shows 2 points in time and how the capacity of different airports is. So this is where we see Amsterdam is the largest international airport this week, but airports, just like airlines, faring quite differently, aren't they? Some of, obviously, I guess it goes without saying, the Singapores, the Bangkoks, the Kuala Lumpurs, the ones relying on sixth freedom traffic quite a bit, really struggling more. They've seen a much bigger loss in capacity compared to some of the ones that are just more about O&D travel and leisure travel.
And those that are blessed with domestic markets.
Yeah.
And obviously we're looking at international capacity here. And Amsterdam, Wilco, I mean, you must be so delighted with the relative success of your summer compared to many others.
Yep.
It's been great. But to see an airport like Antalya ranked as 9th in the world this week in terms of international capacity, there are some iconic airports where we traditionally, our perception is there's lots of international people connecting, traveling across regions, vast continental journeys, Hong Kong, Incheon, Singapore, Kuala Lumpur, where international capacity has just fallen off a cliff. JFK is another one, a much heavier international reliance than domestic.
Yep.
Okay.
For us, it's a nice picture, let's put it that way, and it's it would be nice to see it in place. I mean, we've always been one of the larger international capacity in the world with Dubai, Heathrow, and Frankfurt. So, but yeah, if you look at some of the lines going down there, that really shows how close those countries or those airports are at this moment.
Becca, Alex has asked us, what do you see as the future for Southend? I think if I was a CEO at Southend, I might take a long walk on the pier at the moment. There is a very clear hierarchy of capacity demand in the London air system, with Heathrow clearly number 1, and then Gatwick number 2, and then Stansted and Luton. And Stansted, with its very large Ryanair presence, deters many others from even stepping foot there, because they know how low the yields will be and how aggressive the competition. And Southend, sadly, is at the end of that supply chain, which makes the recovery very difficult to see for them in the short to medium term. Until the other airports are full, it's unlikely that they're going to see other airlines returning.
So we've got 4 more slides to get through, and we've got about 2 minutes. I think we're going to run over a bit, aren't we, guys? Let me just take a quick look at, we wanted to look very quickly at Russia, which has done remarkably well. I think we touched on this earlier, where we saw the domestic and international. International not doing as well as domestic. But even so, there are some real hotspots. We're seeing capacity to Egypt up 439%, Maldives up 158%. So I think that the point here was to really show that there are places that can tap into traffic flows one way or another, even in these difficult times, isn't there?
Yeah, and very successfully. I mean, these are destinations. You take the Maldives and you take Egypt, and specifically we're talking about the Red Sea resorts. Their economies are dependent on tourism, and they have flipped and switched their major source markets at this moment in time to those destinations that can supply tourists who've got dollars or rubles to spend. And it's been very successful. But Russian tourism is more than just Europe, Becca. I mean, Aeroflot have announced a winter service to Punta Cana in the Dominican Republic, and they have a relatively large network into the Caribbean already, a mix of scheduled and charter services, and Russians are still traveling and visiting overseas destinations. So it's been very successful for those countries that have been able transition to Russia as a major source market.
Yeah. TSA data, we've updated that. So this is the US passenger numbers going through US airports through the security systems. Latest data for August, so it's a couple of weeks out of date. We've just done it by month here. The traveller throughput is 77% of where it was in 2019, capacity at 84%. So we're seeing that difference in between traffic and capacity, but not as big perhaps as we would have thought, or it has been.
No, I mean they've had a relatively strong summer, and you know, airlines have created demand and switched lots of capacity into the leisure states, destinations like Florida, California, Arizona, and that's been very strong. The key question would be, rather like in China, how sustainable is it for these airlines to live purely on domestic markets with a little bit of international travel and capacity as well? But it's good to see that the TSA numbers have been growing, and you know, that is a positive sign. Long may it continue. I suspect it won't be as strong in the next couple of months though.
Yeah, okay. And looking ahead to the schedule, at the moment, this thick yellow line is where we see capacity in the schedule at the moment. This vertical line is where we are today. So everything to the right of that is yet to happen. And the dotted lines are snapshots in the past of where capacity was. So this top one back on the 5th of July, what the airlines had filed, and we can see just a huge amount of capacity has come out. And every week still, we're seeing capacity come out of the schedule. So if no more came out, if we end the year here at about 83 million, that's still 20% below 2019, isn't it, John? But our expectation is that this line will come down, won't it?
Yeah, at the moment, the average drop-off rate per week to the year end is about 17 million seats. So every Sunday morning after I've been to church and I count the numbers, you know, there's about 17 million seats that have been taken out by airlines to the year end. It will reduce, you know, by the time we get to November, they'll only be taking 6 or 7 million seats out to the end of December. But I think the prognosis is somewhere in the 70s would be really good by year end, unless something significant happens in terms of a reopening of global markets and essentially the recovery of international capacity and demand to go with it. My expectation, Becca, is that at year end, into global capacity will have grown by about 15% on the numbers we had in 2020, and this was the year that the industry was hoping for to bounce back. Well, if it's bounced back, it was a very flat ball that was bounced.
Yeah, yeah. One more slide just to look at the volatility that we're seeing. So we've talked every time we've done these webinars about how the schedule is being changed on a week-by-week basis, but it is way more change, isn't it, still, than what we used to see in the past. By our reckoning at the moment, about 14 times more change happening in the 2 weeks prior to a flight than we saw 2 years ago. That's really hard for airlines to manage, isn't it, for suppliers to, you know, businesses in the supply chain to manage.
Oh, it's horrible. I mean, it's not just for airlines; it's for airports. It's for everyone. I mean, this is
the passengers also.
Yeah, controlling how many immigration people you have, or you don't have at Heathrow. But traditionally, airlines do not like making big schedule changes. You know, they will do it perhaps 3 times a year. End of March for the summer season in the Northern Hemisphere, perhaps May, June when the peak months begin to ramp up, and then again at the end of October. But they're not into capacity changes of these sizes and scales on a regular basis. It is just so difficult for them to manage in terms of their own crewing, their own rostering, you know, their networks, the rebookings that this is creating for them. And not just you know, talking about the supply chain, the number of airline schedule files that OAG are receiving on a daily basis has probably increased 5 or 6-fold compared to 2019. And you know, it's a miracle, the work the ladies are doing in that particular team to keep ahead and to keep track of everything that is happening. But you know, the most frightening thing is, Becca, if you look at a data set that you had 2 weeks ago and you look at it now, perhaps 2 years ago you would have said, oh, it wouldn't have changed much. The numbers will look about the same. In some cases, you know, they've changed by 20%, 25%. How can anyone plan in that crazy world?
Mm-hmm.
How is it at Amsterdam, Wilco? Is this really still having an effect on your operations?
Yeah, it is, because I mean, airlines try to react as quickly as possible where they can, and sometimes they announce that they are going to start an operation, and the next week it's not in the system anymore, and then there's all of a sudden something else. So I mean, KLM has also announced for this winter that they were planning to go to 6 new leisure destinations from Amsterdam. And they already had to cancel 2 of them, like Phuket and to Orlando, I think it was, because the travel restrictions wouldn't allow it to make it happen. So that's of course pretty sad. But on the other hand, we also have seen there are opportunities. We also see some light in the tunnel. We were missing Air Canada for a long time. And they'll be coming back in mid-December to, in fact, just pick up on the Christmas traffic that they would expect. But we've also seen new airlines coming into Amsterdam, like WestJet from Calgary, Kuwait Airways started last week, and Middle East Airlines and Sky Express. So there are some plus sides on it also.
Yeah, good. So it's good to hear some positive stories and to hear some.
Yeah, I had to balance it out what John is saying. Yeah.
Yeah, I know.
Sorry, I'm just.
John doesn't mean to be Mr. Doom and Gloom, but when
it's the realism of the data, I'm afraid.
Yeah, you're right. You're correct. We rely on it.
I think we need to draw the discussion to an end. We've gone over time, but thank you very much, both of you, for all your insights. I think that's been really useful. We'll be back next month. I think it's going to be the 20th of October, so just a little bit later in the month. Do join us next time. Do register in advance. And as I said at the beginning, you'll be getting an email shortly with this webinar if you want to listen again. Thanks very much. Thanks, Wilco. Thanks, John. Have a good week.
Pleasure.
Thanks, Becca. Thanks, John. Bye, everybody. Bye-bye.